Milgram's obedience study. You walk into what looks like a normal psychology lab, but there's a machine that will haunt your nightmares. It's covered in switches, labeled from 15 volts all the way up to 450 volts. The final switches are marked Danger, Severe Shock. A man in a white coat tells you this is a learning experiment. Every time the person in the next room gets a question wrong, you flip a switch and electrocute them. Start small, just 15 volts. But with each wrong answer, you turn up the voltage. At first, you hear nothing, then mild complaints. At 120 volts, the person screams that the shocks are painful. At 150 volts, they're begging to be let out. At 285 volts, they let out an agonizing scream. At 330 volts, complete silence. The man in the white coat remains calm. "Please continue," he says quietly. "The experiment requires that you continue." Here's the question that kept Stanley Milgram awake at night in 1961. How far would you go? Would you keep flipping switches even as someone screams in agony, even after they fall silent? Before Milgram ran this experiment, he asked psychiatrists to predict the results. They said maybe one person in 1,000 would go all the way to 450 volts. These were Yale professors. They knew human nature, right? They were spectacularly wrong. 65% of people, nearly 2 out of every 3, went all the way to the maximum voltage. They didn't enjoy it. Many were sweating, trembling, even crying. But they kept going. A quiet man in a lab coat said, "Continue." So they continued. Now here's the twist that makes your blood run cold. There were no real shocks. The person screaming was an actor, but the participants didn't know that. As far as they knew, they were torturing an innocent stranger to death, and they did it anyway. Milgram had just proven something terrifying about human nature. We like to think evil requires evil people, monsters, sociopaths, the truly disturbed. But that's not true. Evil just requires ordinary people in the right situation. The Holocaust wasn't carried out by a nation of psychopaths. It was carried out by people just like you, just like me, who found themselves in a system where authority figures made cruelty seem normal. The most disturbing part? Most participants suspected what they were doing was wrong. They just couldn't bring themselves to disobey. That's how powerful authority can be. It can make us betray our deepest moral convictions while we're fully aware we're doing it. So the next time you wonder how ordinary people can do terrible things, remember the shock machine. Remember that 65% of people just like you were willing to electrocute a stranger because someone in a lab coat told them to. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Imagine you're a college student who needs some extra cash. You see an ad in the paper. Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life. $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. That's good money in 1971, so you apply. You pass all the psychological tests. You're mentally healthy, stable, and from a good family. You and 23 other guys get selected. Half of you will be prisoners, half will be guards. It's decided by a coin flip. If you're chosen as a prisoner, here's what happens. Real police officers show up at your house with sirens blaring, handcuff you in front of your neighbors, and take you to Stanford University. You're stripped naked, sprayed with a delousing powder, and given a smock with a number on it. From now on, you're not a person. You're a number. If you're a guard, you get a uniform, a whistle, and mirrored sunglasses. You're told to maintain order, that's it. No training, no specific instructions about how to treat prisoners. Philip Zimbardo, the psychologist running this show, expects it to last 2 weeks. He's studying whether prison brutality comes from bad people becoming guards, or if the prison environment itself creates monsters. He gets his answer in less than a week. Within hours, the guards begin asserting their power. They wake prisoners in the middle of the night for counts. They make them do push-ups. They take away their mattresses. This isn't in any rule book. They're making it up as they go along. By day 2, the prisoners rebel. They barricade themselves in their cells and refuse to come out. The guards don't call for help or follow some protocol. Instead, they get creative with punishment. They strip the rebels naked, put them in solitary confinement, and take away their basic privileges. Then something truly chilling happens. The guards start to enjoy it. They volunteer for extra shifts. They come up with increasingly humiliating punishments. They make prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands, simulate sexual acts with each other, and refer to themselves only by their numbers. One guard later said he felt like he was in a movie, like he was playing a role. But the prisoners weren't acting. They were genuinely breaking down. One prisoner had a complete emotional breakdown on day 2 and had to be released. Others showed signs of severe depression and learned helplessness. The most disturbing part? Zimbardo himself got so caught up in playing the role of prison superintendent that he lost sight of the fact that this was supposed to be an experiment. When prisoners' families came to visit, he found himself resenting them for potentially disrupting his prison. It took an outsider, a graduate student who wasn't part of the experiment, to walk in and say, "What you're doing to these boys is terrible." Only then did Zimbardo realize how far things had gone. The experiment ended on day 6, after just 6 days of role-playing had transformed normal, healthy college students into either broken victims or sadistic guards. 24 good kids had been divided by nothing more than random chance and costume changes, yet they'd created a miniature version of the worst aspects of real prison life. Zimbardo had his answer. It wasn't that bad people become prison guards. It was that the prison environment itself could turn good people into monsters, sometimes in a matter of hours. Asch's Conformity Studies. Picture this. You walk into a room for what you think is a vision test. 7 other people are already seated in a row, and you take the last chair. The experimenter shows everyone 2 cards. On the left card is a single line. On the right card are 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. One of them is clearly the same length as the line on the left. This isn't a trick question. Line B is obviously the match. It's so obvious that if you were alone, you'd get it right 99% of the time. But here's where things get weird. The experimenter starts at the other end of the row, asking each person which line matches. One by one, the first 7 people all give the same answer, line A. You know they're wrong. Your eyes tell you they're wrong. But now it's your turn. What do you say? Solomon Asch ran this exact scenario in 1951, and what he discovered about human conformity will make your skin crawl. Those 7 other people? They were all actors, instructed to give obviously wrong answers on certain trials. Asch wanted to know, when faced with a group that's clearly wrong, will people trust their own eyes or go along with the crowd? The results were stunning. When people were tested alone, they got the answer right 99% of the time. But when surrounded by a group giving wrong answers, 75% of people conformed at least once. On average, people went along with the obviously wrong group about 1/3 of the time. Think about that. People were willing to deny the evidence of their own eyes just to avoid standing out from a group of strangers they'd never see again. But here's what makes it even more fascinating. Asch tried variations of the experiment to see what would break this conformity spell. If just one other person in the group gave the right answer, conformity dropped dramatically. Having just one ally was enough to give people the courage to trust their own judgment. He also found that the size of the group mattered, but not how you'd expect. The conformity effect maxed out at about 3 or 4 people. Adding more people to the group didn't make conformity much stronger. Most revealing were the interviews afterward. People who conformed weren't stupid. They knew something was off. Some thought their vision was playing tricks on them. Others suspected the group might be wrong but couldn't bear to be the odd one out. A few even convinced themselves that the group must see something they couldn't. But perhaps the most disturbing group were those who knew the group was wrong, knew their own answer was right, but went along anyway because standing out felt too uncomfortable. Asch had revealed something profound about human nature. We have a deep, almost involuntary need to fit in, even when fitting in means denying reality. This isn't just about politeness or social harmony. It's about something much deeper. We're social animals, and being rejected by the group feels dangerous at a primal level. This experiment explains so much about the world around us. Why do people go along with obviously bad ideas in meetings? Why do entire societies sometimes embrace beliefs that seem crazy in hindsight? Why is it so hard to be the first person to question the group consensus? The answer is simple and terrifying, because standing alone against a group, even when you know you're right, goes against one of our deepest psychological drives. We'd rather be wrong together than right alone. The Bystander Effect. It's 3:20 a.m. on the 13th of March 1964, in Queens, New York. Kitty Genovese is walking home from work when a man attacks her with a knife. She screams for help. Lights turn on in apartment windows. People look out and see what's happening. The attacker runs away, but then comes back and attacks her again. She screams again. More lights, more faces in windows. The attacker runs off a second time, but he returns once more, follows her into her apartment building, and kills her. The whole attack takes over half an hour. Newspaper reports claim that 38 people witnessed the murder, but not one of them called the police or came to help. How could so many people watch someone being murdered and do nothing? This story horrified America and launched 1,000 think pieces about urban apathy and moral decay. But two psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latane, suspected something else was going on. Maybe the problem wasn't that people didn't care. Maybe it was that too many people were watching. So in 1968, they designed one of the most ingenious experiments in psychology to test their theory. Here's how it worked. You're a college student participating in what you think is a discussion about personal problems faced by students. To preserve anonymity, you're in separate rooms, talking through an intercom system. You're told there are either 2, 3, or 6 people total in the study. During the discussion, one participant, actually a recording, mentions that he suffers from seizures. Later, you hear him having what sounds like a serious seizure. He's choking, gasping, asking for help, saying he's going to die. The question: do you help? Do you leave your room to find him or call for assistance? The results were shocking. When people thought they were the only ones who could hear the emergency, 85% helped within the first minute. But when they thought 4 other people could also hear, only 31% helped, and they took much longer to act. Darley and Latane had discovered the bystander effect. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any individual is to help. It seems backwards. Shouldn't more people mean more help? But that's not how human psychology works. They identified 2 psychological processes that explain this paradox. First is diffusion of responsibility. When you're alone, you feel 100% responsible for helping. But when others are present, that responsibility gets spread around. Someone else will handle it, you think. Someone else is probably better qualified. I'm sure someone already called the police. The second process is pluralistic ignorance. In ambiguous situations, we look to other people for cues about how to react. If everyone else seems calm, we assume everything must be fine. But here's the catch. Everyone else is doing the same thing, looking around for cues while trying to appear calm themselves. So everyone interprets everyone else's calm exterior as a sign that help isn't needed. The researchers tested this in another brilliant experiment. They had people sit in a room filling out questionnaires when smoke started pouring in through a vent. When people were alone, 75% reported the smoke within 4 minutes. But when they were with 2 other people who were secretly instructed to ignore the smoke, only 10% reported it. Even as the room filled with smoke so thick they could barely see their questionnaires, people kept working rather than risk looking foolish. The implications are staggering. The bystander effect helps explain not just failures to help in emergencies, but also why people don't speak up about harassment in the workplace, why witnesses to bullying often do nothing, and why entire communities can ignore obvious problems. But here's the silver lining. Once you know about the bystander effect, you can fight it. If you're ever in an emergency, don't just yell, "Help." Instead, point to a specific person and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. By assigning responsibility to one individual, you break the diffusion of responsibility and dramatically increase the chances they'll act. The tragic irony of the Kitty Genovese case? Later investigation revealed that the initial reports were largely wrong. Far fewer people witnessed the attack than originally claimed, and several people did try to help. But the myth of 38 silent witnesses sparked research that revealed a very real psychological phenomenon, one that affects all of us, usually without our even realizing it. Jane Elliott's Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes Experiment. The 5th of April, 1968. The day after Martin Luther King, Jr. was assassinated, Jane Elliott walked into her third-grade classroom in the all-white farming town of Riceville, Iowa, with a lesson plan that would change her students' lives forever. Her students had been asking questions about the assassination, trying to understand racism and discrimination. Elliott realized that simply talking about prejudice wouldn't be enough. These children needed to experience it firsthand. "Today we're going to discover what it's like to be judged by the color of your eyes," she announced to her confused 8-year-olds. Elliott divided her class based on eye color. On the first day, she told them that blue-eyed people were superior to brown-eyed people. Blue-eyed children, she explained, were smarter, cleaner, and better behaved. They would get extra privileges, 5 extra minutes at recess, second helpings at lunch, and the right to drink from the water fountain. Brown-eyed children had to use paper cups. To make the groups easily distinguishable, brown-eyed children had to wear cloth collars around their necks, a visible marker of their supposed inferiority. What happened next was both fascinating and horrifying to watch. Within hours, the blue-eyed children transformed into confident, arrogant mini-supremacists. They walked taller, spoke louder, and began actively discriminating against their brown-eyed classmates. "You better listen to us," one blue-eyed boy told a brown-eyed friend. "We're smarter than you." The brown-eyed children, meanwhile, became withdrawn and submissive. Their academic performance actually declined. They made more mistakes on simple tasks they had easily completed the day before. They seemed to internalize the message that they were inferior, and their behavior began to match those expectations. These weren't troubled kids or natural bullies. They were the same children who had played together harmoniously just the day before. Eye color, which had been completely irrelevant 24 hours earlier, had become the basis for a rigid social hierarchy. But Elliott wasn't done. The next day, she reversed the roles. Now brown-eyed children were superior, and blue-eyed children wore the collars of inferiority. The same transformation occurred, just in reverse. The previously oppressed brown-eyed children immediately began asserting their dominance, while the formerly privileged blue-eyed children wilted under discrimination. When Elliott finally revealed that the whole thing was an exercise, the children were initially confused, then relieved, then profoundly changed. They had experienced both sides of discrimination and understood in their bones what it felt like to be judged by an arbitrary physical characteristic. The experiment was so powerful that Elliott repeated it with adults in workshops around the country. The results were the same, sometimes even more dramatic. Educated, professional adults would quickly fall into patterns of discrimination and submission based on nothing more than eye color and the authority of the workshop leader. One particularly striking example involved a group of prison guards and corrections officers. Within minutes of being divided by eye color, the inferior group began showing the same psychological symptoms as the children: decreased confidence, impaired performance, and visible stress. These were adults whose job it was to maintain authority, yet they crumbled under artificial discrimination. Elliott's experiment revealed several disturbing truths about human nature. First, we can be conditioned to discriminate incredibly quickly, sometimes in a matter of hours. Second, both the oppressors and the oppressed internalize their roles almost immediately. The superior group genuinely begins to feel superior, while the inferior group genuinely begins to feel inferior. Perhaps most unsettling, the experiment showed how easily arbitrary physical differences can become the basis for social hierarchy. If children could develop such strong prejudices based on eye color in a single day, what did that say about prejudices based on skin color that had been reinforced for centuries? Critics argued that Elliott's methods were too harsh, that she was traumatizing children to make a point. But follow-up studies with her students years later showed something remarkable. They had become more empathetic, less prejudiced, and more aware of discrimination than their peers. The temporary discomfort had created lasting insight. Elliott's experiment also demonstrated the power of authority figures in shaping social norms. When a trusted teacher announced that blue-eyed people were superior, the children didn't question it. They accepted it as fact and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This revealed how discrimination can be learned and internalized through seemingly legitimate channels. The blue eyes, brown eyes experiment became one of the most powerful demonstrations of how quickly and easily prejudice can develop. It showed that racism isn't necessarily born from deep-seated hatred or fundamental differences between groups. It can emerge from simple categorization combined with differential treatment. Most importantly, Elliott proved that discrimination is learned, not innate. If prejudice could be taught in a single day, then tolerance and acceptance could be taught as well. Her experiment became a powerful argument for actively challenging discrimination wherever it exists, because left unchecked, even the most arbitrary prejudices can quickly become entrenched social realities. The lesson Elliott taught her students, and the world, was simple but profound. Discrimination hurts everyone involved, and the only way to truly understand it is to experience both sides of it. In a world still struggling with prejudice and inequality, that lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1968. The Robbers Cave Experiment. Summer Camp 1954. 22 11-year-old boys arrive at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, excited for what they think will be the best 3 weeks of their lives. They have no idea they're about to become subjects in one of the most elaborate social psychology experiments ever conducted. The man running this summer camp isn't a camp director. He's Muzaffar Sheriff, a social psychologist with a burning question. How quickly can you turn friends into enemies, and enemies back into friends? Sheriff carefully selected these boys. They were all white, middle-class, Protestant, and had never met before. They were also screened to be mentally healthy, well-adjusted, and from stable families. In other words, these were good kids, the kind you'd want your own children to befriend. But Sheriff had a plan that would test the very limits of human tribal behavior. The boys were secretly divided into 2 groups and housed in separate cabins. For the first week, they didn't even know the other group existed. Each group bonded naturally, choosing names for themselves, the Rattlers and the Eagles, and developing their own cultures, inside jokes, and leadership structures. Then Sheriff introduced the groups to each other through a series of competitions. Baseball games, tug-of-war contests, treasure hunts. The winning group would get prizes like medals and pocket knives. The losers would get nothing. What happened next was like watching civilization collapse in fast forward. Within days, these well-adjusted boys transformed into hostile tribes. They called each other names, burned each other's flags, and raided each other's cabins. The Rattlers called the Eagles stinkers and sissies. The Eagles retaliated by calling the Rattlers braggers and worse. It escalated quickly. Boys who had been perfectly nice individually became vicious in their groups. They threw food at each other in the mess hall. They stockpiled rocks to throw at the other group. They planned midnight raids and sabotage missions. Keep in mind, these boys had no history with each other, no real reason for conflict, no meaningful differences. They'd been divided purely by random assignment and artificial competition. Yet within days, they showed all the hallmarks of deep intergroup hostility. But Sheriff wasn't done. Having successfully created hatred between the groups, he now wanted to see if he could eliminate it. First, he tried simple contact, just having the groups spend time together. That didn't work. If anything, it made things worse, giving them more opportunities to fight. Next, he tried appealing to moral values, bringing in religious leaders to talk about cooperation and brotherhood. That failed too. The boys listened politely, then went right back to plotting against each other. Finally, Sheriff introduced what he called superordinate goals, problems that neither group could solve alone, but that affected both groups equally. The camp's water supply mysteriously broke down. The groups had to work together to fix it, or everyone would go thirsty. A truck carrying food for both groups got stuck, and they had to cooperate to pull it out. Slowly, the hostility began to fade. Boys who had been mortal enemies the week before started working side by side. They began to see members of the other group as individuals again rather than just the enemy. By the end of the camp, many had formed friendships across group lines. Sheriff had demonstrated something profound about human nature. We're tribal creatures. programmed to form strong loyalties to our own group and suspicion of others. This tribalism can be triggered by the most trivial differences, even something as meaningless as a random assignment to a cabin. But the experiment also showed that intergroup conflict isn't inevitable. When groups face common challenges that require cooperation, old hostilities can fade remarkably quickly. The implications are everywhere around us. Think about political polarization, racial tensions, conflicts between departments at work, or even sports rivalries. The Robbers Cave experiment suggests that much of this hostility isn't based on fundamental irreconcilable differences, but on the simple psychological tendency to favor our own group and distrust others. The solution? Don't just bring opposing groups together. Give them shared challenges that require cooperation to solve. Make them teammates in facing a common problem, and watch how quickly us versus them can become just us. The broken windows theory. The Bronx, 1969. Philip Zimbardo, the same psychologist who would later conduct the Stanford Prison Experiment, parks two identical cars on two very different streets. One car goes in the heart of the Bronx, in a high-crime neighborhood. The other is placed in Palo Alto, California, in an affluent area near Stanford University. Both cars have their license plates removed and their hoods propped open, subtle signals that they've been abandoned. Zimbardo wants to see what happens next. Within 10 minutes, the first vandals appear in the Bronx. A family, father, mother, and young son, strip the car of its battery and radiator. Within 24 hours, virtually everything of value has been removed. Then the random destruction begins. Windows are smashed, parts are torn off, upholstery is ripped. Within a week, the car is completely destroyed. Meanwhile, in Palo Alto, the car sits untouched for more than a week. Finally, Zimbardo decides to give it a push. He takes a sledgehammer and smashes part of the car himself. Within hours, passers-by begin joining in. These aren't gang members or career criminals. They're mostly well-dressed, middle-class residents who see the damaged car as an invitation to add their own destruction. Zimbardo had just demonstrated what would become known as the broken windows theory. The idea that visible signs of disorder and neglect create an environment that encourages further disorder and neglect. The theory gained widespread attention when criminologists James Wilson and George Kelling wrote about it in 1982. They argued that crime isn't just about individual criminals making bad choices. It's about environmental cues that signal whether antisocial behavior is tolerated or punished. A broken window left unrepaired signals that no one cares about the building. This attracts more vandalism, then more serious property crimes, and eventually violent crime. Not because broken windows directly cause murder, but because they create an atmosphere where social norms have broken down. The theory seemed to explain why some neighborhoods spiral into decay, while others maintain order. It suggested that small acts of maintenance, fixing broken windows, cleaning graffiti, maintaining public spaces, could prevent larger problems from developing. New York City famously embraced this theory under Police Commissioner William Bratton. They began aggressively prosecuting minor crimes like subway fare evasion, public urination, and graffiti. The logic was that by maintaining order in small things, they could prevent disorder in big things. Crime rates did fall dramatically during this period, leading many to credit the broken windows approach. But the theory also attracted criticism. Critics argued that correlation wasn't causation. Crime might have fallen for other reasons, like economic improvements or demographic changes. More troubling, some argued that broken windows policing disproportionately targeted poor and minority communities, criminalizing behaviors that middle-class people might get away with. The same act of public drinking might be ignored in one neighborhood but result in arrest in another. But the psychological principle behind broken windows theory has been demonstrated in numerous studies. Researchers have found that signs of disorder really do encourage more disorder, even among people who wouldn't normally break rules. In one study, researchers scattered flyers on cars in a parking lot. When the parking lot was clean and well maintained, 25% of people littered by dropping the flyers on the ground. But when the parking lot was already covered with litter, 54% of people added to the mess. Another study looked at graffiti and bicycle theft. When researchers placed bicycles near walls with graffiti, theft rates were significantly higher than when the same bikes were placed near clean walls. The graffiti seemed to signal that rules weren't enforced in that area. The broken windows effect extends beyond crime to all sorts of social behaviors. Studies have found that people are more likely to cheat on tests in messy rooms, more likely to be rude in environments that seem neglected, and more likely to break minor rules when they see evidence that others have already done so. This has important implications for how we design and maintain our communities. Small acts of neglect, an untrimmed lawn, a broken streetlight, litter on the sidewalk, don't just make neighborhoods look bad. They send psychological signals about what behavior is acceptable. But the theory also offers hope. If disorder begets disorder, then order can beget order. Communities that invest in maintaining their physical environment may see improvements in social behavior as well. Simple acts like cleaning up trash, fixing vandalism quickly, and maintaining public spaces can help establish norms of civic responsibility. The broken windows experiment revealed something important about human psychology. We're constantly reading environmental cues to determine what behavior is appropriate. When we see signs that others have broken rules without consequences, we're more likely to break rules ourselves. When we see signs that someone cares about maintaining order, we're more likely to follow suit. The key insight isn't that broken windows directly cause crime, but that they're part of a broader system of social signaling. What we allow to remain broken sends a message about what we value and what we'll tolerate. In that sense, every neighborhood, every organization, every community is constantly teaching lessons about what standards matter. The question is, what lessons is your environment teaching? The Marshmallow Test. Stanford University, 1972. A 4-year-old child sits alone in a small room with nothing but a table, a chair, and a single marshmallow on a plate. A researcher has just made them an offer that will define how we think about self-control and success for the next 50 years. You can eat this marshmallow right now if you want, the researcher says, but if you can wait until I come back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows instead. I'll be gone for about 15 minutes. The researcher leaves, and the child faces one of the most difficult challenges in human psychology: delaying gratification when temptation is sitting right in front of them. What happens next is both hilarious and heartbreaking to watch. Some kids grab the marshmallow the second the door closes. Others try to resist but cave within minutes. But some, about a third, develop elaborate strategies to make it through the full 15 minutes. They turn away from the marshmallow. They cover their eyes. They sing songs, tell themselves stories, or pretend the marshmallow is something else entirely, maybe a fluffy cloud or a cotton ball, anything except a delicious treat. Some even lick the marshmallow or nibble tiny pieces off the bottom, technically following the rules while bending them to their breaking point. Walter Mischel, the psychologist behind this experiment, wasn't just studying cute kid behavior. He was investigating something fundamental: the ability to delay gratification in service of a larger goal. And what he discovered would revolutionize our understanding of success. Mischel followed these children for decades. When they became teenagers, he found something remarkable. The kids who had waited for the second marshmallow scored higher on their SATs, about 210 points higher on average. They had better grades, fewer behavioral problems, and were rated as more competent by their parents. As adults, the high delayers had lower body mass indexes, lower rates of obesity, less drug use, and higher educational attainment. They even showed different brain activity patterns when faced with temptation, with more activity in areas associated with self-control. The Marshmallow Test seemed to have identified something like a superpower: the ability to resist immediate temptation for future reward. And this superpower, measured at age 4, appeared to predict success across virtually every area of life. The media went crazy. Parenting books declared that teaching self-control was the key to raising successful children. The Marshmallow Test became shorthand for the importance of willpower and discipline. But like many great psychological discoveries, the story turned out to be more complicated than it first appeared. Later research revealed that a child's ability to wait wasn't just about innate willpower. It was heavily influenced by their environment and experiences. Kids who had unreliable caregivers or inconsistent environments were much more likely to grab the immediate reward, not because they lacked self-control, but because they'd learned that promises from adults couldn't always be trusted. The test also reflected broader socioeconomic factors. Children from more stable, affluent backgrounds were more likely to delay gratification, partly because they'd learned that good things generally do come to those who wait. Kids from chaotic or impoverished environments might reasonably conclude that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Even more fascinating, Mischel discovered that self-control isn't really about having iron willpower, it's about having good strategies. The kids who succeeded didn't just try harder to resist temptation, they found clever ways to make the temptation less tempting. They distracted themselves, reframed the situation, or changed their environment. This insight has profound implications. It suggests that self-control isn't a fixed trait you're born with or without. It's a skill that can be learned and improved through better strategies and environmental design. Want to eat healthier? Don't rely on willpower when you're standing in front of the refrigerator. Remove the junk food from your house entirely. Want to save money? Set up automatic transfers to your savings account so you never have to actively choose to save. The Marshmallow Test taught us that success isn't just about having self-control, it's about being smart with how you exercise it. The children who succeeded weren't necessarily more disciplined. They were more strategic about managing their own psychology. In the end, the Marshmallow Test revealed something beautiful about human nature. Even 4-year-olds can be remarkably resourceful when faced with difficult challenges. They can't change their fundamental desires, but they can change how they think about and respond to those desires, and that might be the most important skill of all. Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory. May 21, 1956. A Chicago housewife named Dorothy Martin, though researchers called her Marion Keech, gathers her followers for what she believes will be their final day on Earth. She's received messages from aliens on the planet Clarion, warning that a great flood will destroy the world at midnight. But there's hope. The faithful will be rescued by flying saucers before the catastrophe hits. As midnight approaches, the believers sit in Martin's living room, having given away their possessions and quit their jobs. They've removed all metal from their clothing. Apparently, metal interferes with the alien rescue beams. They wait, and wait, and wait. Midnight passes. No flood, no flying saucers, nothing. Most people would expect the group to disband in embarrassment, but social psychologist Leon Festinger had a different prediction. He and his colleagues had infiltrated the group specifically to observe what happens when deeply held beliefs crash into undeniable reality. What they witnessed became one of the most important discoveries in social psychology: cognitive dissonance theory. Instead of admitting they were wrong, the group did something remarkable. By dawn, they had completely reinterpreted what had happened. Their faith, they decided, had been so strong that God had decided to spare the earth. The flood had been called off because of their devotion. They hadn't been wrong. They'd been so right that they'd literally saved the world. Not only did most believers stick with the group, but they also began actively recruiting new members for the first time. Having survived the crisis of disconfirmed prophecy, they became more convinced than ever that their beliefs were true. Festinger realized he had witnessed something fundamental about human psychology. When we hold two contradictory beliefs, thoughts, or values simultaneously, we experience an uncomfortable mental state he called cognitive dissonance. This discomfort is so unpleasant that our minds will go to extraordinary lengths to reduce it, even if it means distorting reality itself. To test this theory systematically, Festinger designed one of psychology's most ingenious experiments. Students were brought into a lab and asked to spend an hour doing incredibly boring tasks, turning pegs a quarter turn at a time, then turning them back over and over again. It was mind-numbing by design. Afterward, the experimenter asked for a favor. The next participant was waiting outside, and they needed someone to tell them how interesting and enjoyable the study was. Some students were offered $1 for this lie. Others were offered $20, about $150 today. Later, when researchers asked the students how much they had actually enjoyed the boring task, something fascinating emerged. The students who were paid $20 to lie rated the task as genuinely boring, which it was. But the students who were paid only $1 convinced themselves they had actually enjoyed it. Why? The $20 group could easily justify their lie. They were paid well for it, so there was no dissonance. But the $1 group faced a psychological dilemma. They had lied for almost no money, which would make them feel foolish and dishonest. To reduce this discomfort, their minds unconsciously changed their memory of the experience. If they told someone the boring task was fun, then it must have actually been fun, right? This wasn't conscious deception. These people genuinely came to believe their own reinterpretation of events. Their brains literally rewrote their memories to eliminate the uncomfortable contradiction between their actions and their self-image. Cognitive dissonance explains so much about human behavior that once you understand it, you'll see it everywhere. Why do people who make poor investments often double down instead of cutting their losses? Because admitting the investment was bad would create dissonance with their self-image as smart decision makers. Why do people stay in bad relationships or unfulfilling jobs? Because acknowledging they've wasted years would be psychologically painful, so they convince themselves things aren't that bad. Why do smokers downplay health risks, or people who buy expensive cars suddenly notice how unreliable other brands are? Because changing behavior or admitting mistakes creates dissonance, while changing beliefs is often psychologically easier. Perhaps most disturbing, cognitive dissonance helps explain how people maintain beliefs in the face of contradictory evidence. When reality conflicts with our worldview, we're more likely to question reality than our beliefs. We seek out information that confirms what we already believe and dismiss information that challenges us. But understanding cognitive dissonance can also be liberating. Once you recognize that your brain is constantly working to maintain consistency between your beliefs and actions, even at the cost of accuracy, you can start to catch yourself in the act. You can learn to sit with uncomfortable contradictions long enough to examine them honestly. The cult members who waited for the flying saucers weren't stupid or crazy. They were displaying a perfectly normal human psychological process taken to an extreme. We all have beliefs we've invested too much in to abandon easily. The question is, are we brave enough to notice when we're doing it? The invisible gorilla experiment. You're sitting in a psychology lab, watching a video of 6 people passing basketballs. 3 are wearing white shirts, 3 are wearing black shirts. Your job seems simple. Count how many times the people in white shirts pass the ball to each other. You focus intently on the white-shirted players, tracking every pass. Left to right to left, bounce pass, chest pass. You're concentrating so hard that you barely notice the people in black shirts. They're just background noise to your counting task. 15 seconds in, something extraordinary happens, but you don't see it. A person in a gorilla suit walks directly into the middle of the scene, faces the camera, beats their chest, and walks off. The gorilla is on screen for 9 full seconds, clearly visible in the center of the action. When the video ends, the experimenter asks you how many passes you counted. 15, you say confidently. Then comes the question that will shake your faith in your own perception. Did you see the gorilla? What gorilla? In 1999, Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris conducted what would become one of the most famous experiments in psychology. They discovered that about half of all viewers, intelligent, attentive people who were trying their best to complete the task, completely failed to notice a gorilla walking through the scene. This wasn't a matter of poor eyesight or lack of attention. The gorilla was clearly visible, right in the center of the action. But because people were focused on counting passes by players in white shirts, their brains simply didn't register the gorilla as important enough to enter conscious awareness. Simons and Chabris had discovered something profound about human perception. We don't see nearly as much as we think we do. What we call paying attention is actually a process of selective focus that filters out huge amounts of information, including things that should be impossible to miss. They called this phenomenon inattentional blindness, the failure to notice fully visible objects or events when our attention is directed elsewhere. The invisible gorilla became the most famous example of how our perception is far more limited and selective than we realize. The implications are staggering. If we can miss a gorilla when we're actively trying to pay attention to a simple video, what might we be missing in our daily lives? How many important details, social cues, or even dangers do we fail to notice because our attention is focused elsewhere? The researchers tested many variations of the experiment. Sometimes the gorilla was black, sometimes white. Sometimes it walked across the scene, sometimes it stopped and beat its chest. The results were consistent. Roughly half of focused viewers missed it entirely. Even more remarkable, the people who missed the gorilla were absolutely certain they would have noticed it if it had been there. When told about the gorilla, their first reaction was usually disbelief. There was no gorilla, I would have seen it. Only when shown the video again did they realize what they had missed. This revealed another disturbing truth. We're not just blind to things we don't expect to see, we're blind to our own blindness. We have tremendous confidence in our perceptual abilities, even when that confidence is completely misplaced. The invisible gorilla experiment helps explain many real-world phenomena that otherwise seem inexplicable. How do experienced drivers get into accidents at intersections they've navigated thousands of times? How do radiologists miss tumors that seem obvious in retrospect? How do eyewitnesses give such different accounts of the same event? The answer is inattentional blindness. When we're focused on one task, driving to work, looking for one type of abnormality, watching a crime unfold, we can completely miss other important information, even when it's right in front of us. Studies of radiologists have found that they can miss obvious abnormalities when they're focused on looking for something specific. In one study, researchers inserted a picture of a gorilla into lung scans. Radiologists who were looking for lung nodules missed the gorilla 83% of the time, even though it was 48 times larger than the average nodule they were trained to detect. Police officers experience inattentional blindness too. Studies have found that officers engaged in high-speed chases often fail to notice other crimes happening nearby, even violent ones. Their attention is so focused on the pursuit that everything else becomes invisible. The phenomenon extends to everyday situations as well. How many times have you looked for your keys while holding them in your hand? Searched for your glasses while wearing them? Been introduced to someone and immediately forgotten their name because you were focused on making a good impression? But understanding inattentional blindness can also help us become better observers. Pilots are trained to systematically scan their instruments because they know that focusing on one gauge can cause them to miss critical information from others. Emergency room doctors use checklists to ensure they don't miss important symptoms while treating obvious injuries. The invisible gorilla experiment taught us that attention is not a spotlight that illuminates everything in its path. It's more like a laser pointer that highlights one thing while leaving everything else in darkness. We can choose where to point that laser, but we can't see everything at once. This has profound implications for how we evaluate eyewitness testimony, how we design safety systems, and how we understand human error. Many mistakes that we attribute to carelessness or incompetence are actually the result of attention being focused in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps most importantly, the invisible gorilla reminds us to be humble about our own perception. We all have blind spots, literally and figuratively. The first step to seeing more clearly is acknowledging how much we're not seeing in the first place. The next time you're certain you would have noticed something important, remember the gorilla. Half the people who were actively trying to pay attention missed it completely. What might you be missing right now? The minimal group paradigm. Bristol, England, 1970. Henri Tajfel invites teenage boys into his lab for what seems like a simple psychology experiment. He shows them clusters of dots on a screen for a fraction of a second and asks them to estimate how many dots they saw. Based on their answers, he divides them into two groups: overestimators and underestimators. Here's the thing: the dot counting task was completely meaningless. Tajfel randomly assigned boys to groups regardless of their actual performance. But the boys didn't know this. They believed they'd been categorized based on a real difference in how they perceived the world. What happened next would revolutionize our understanding of prejudice, discrimination, and human tribal behavior. Tajfel gave each boy a booklet with a simple task: distribute points between two anonymous members of the groups, sometimes two members of their own group, sometimes two members of the other group, sometimes one from each group. The points could be converted to real money, so the decisions mattered. Here's what's remarkable. These boys had never met each other. They didn't know who was in their group or the other group. They had no history of conflict. The only thing that distinguished the groups was a meaningless label based on a bogus dot-counting task. Yet immediately, they began showing favoritism toward their own group. When distributing points between two anonymous members of the other group, they were relatively fair. But when one recipient was from their own group and one was from the other group, they consistently gave more points to their own group member. Even more striking, when forced to choose between maximizing their own group's total rewards versus maximizing the difference between their group and the other group, many boys chose to maximize the difference. They would rather their own group get fewer points overall if it meant beating the other group by a larger margin. Think about that. These boys were willing to sacrifice their own group's absolute gain just to maintain superiority over a group of strangers they'd been randomly separated from an hour earlier. Tajfel had discovered something profound and disturbing about human nature. We don't need meaningful differences, historical conflicts, or competition over resources to develop group loyalty and prejudice. The simple act of categorization, even arbitrary categorization, is enough to trigger an us versus them mentality. He called this the minimal group paradigm, and it revealed that intergroup bias could emerge from the thinnest possible foundation, mere categorization into groups. No shared history, no meaningful differences, no competition for resources, just knowing you're in one group and they're in another. The implications were staggering. If people could develop prejudice toward others based on nothing more than random assignment to groups labeled by meaningless categories, what did that say about real-world prejudices based on race, religion, nationality, or political affiliation? Tajfel's findings suggested that much of human prejudice isn't driven by rational calculations about group differences or competition over resources. Instead, it springs from something much more basic: a fundamental tendency to favor our own group simply because it's our group. This tendency, which Tajfel called social identity theory, serves a psychological function. Being part of a group gives us a sense of who we are, and favoring our group helps maintain our self-esteem. When our group succeeds, we feel good about ourselves. When our group is better than other groups, we feel superior. The minimal group paradigm has been replicated hundreds of times with different populations and variations. Researchers have created groups based on coin flips, random assignment, preferences for abstract paintings, and even completely fictional criteria. The result is always the same. People immediately begin showing favoritism toward their randomly assigned group. One particularly striking study assigned people to groups based on whether they preferred the paintings of Wassily Kandinsky or Paul Klee. Participants who had never heard of either artist and couldn't tell their work apart still showed strong bias in favor of their assigned artist's followers. Another study created groups by simply calling them Group X and Group Y, with no explanation of how people were assigned. Even with these completely meaningless labels, participants showed clear in-group favoritism. The minimal group paradigm helps explain some of the most puzzling aspects of human social behavior. Why do sports fans get so emotionally invested in teams they have no real connection to? Why do people develop loyalty to companies, schools, or political parties that may not serve their interests? Why can family reunions turn into battlegrounds over trivial differences? The answer is that humans are hardwired to form groups and favor their own. This tendency probably served our ancestors well when survival depended on group cooperation and loyalty. But in today's complex world, it can lead to unnecessary conflict and prejudice. Perhaps most troubling, the minimal group paradigm suggests that efforts to reduce prejudice by emphasizing similarities between groups may miss the point. Even when people know they're fundamentally similar, The mere act of being placed in different groups can be enough to create bias. But understanding this bias can help us recognize and counteract it. When you find yourself automatically favoring your company over competitors, your political party over others, or your social group over outsiders, remember the boys with the dots. Ask yourself, am I responding to real, meaningful differences, or just to the psychological comfort of being part of an us that's better than them? The minimal group paradigm reveals that tribalism isn't a bug in human psychology, it's a feature. But like many evolved tendencies, what once helped us survive can now hold us back. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize our tribal instincts and choose when to follow them and when to rise above them. The Pygmalion Effect. Oak School, South San Francisco, 1968. Teachers arrive for the new school year and receive exciting news from Harvard researchers. A new test called the Harvard Test of Inflected Acquisition has identified certain students as intellectual bloomers, children who are expected to show remarkable academic growth in the coming year. The teachers are given lists of these special students, who make up about 20% of their classes. The researchers explain that these children have been identified through sophisticated testing as likely to experience significant intellectual development, and they want to track their progress. What the teachers don't know is that they've just become participants in one of the most important experiments in educational psychology. There is no Harvard test of inflected acquisition. The so-called intellectual bloomers were chosen completely at random. The only difference between them and their classmates is that their teachers now expect them to succeed. Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson wanted to test a startling hypothesis that teacher expectations alone could influence student performance. They called this the Pygmalion Effect, after the Greek myth of a sculptor whose statue comes to life because he believes in it so deeply. 8 months later, the researchers returned to test all the students. What they found was remarkable. The randomly selected bloomers had indeed bloomed. They showed significantly greater gains in IQ and academic achievement than their classmates. In first and second grades, the effect was dramatic. The special students gained an average of 12 IQ points more than the control group. How could this be possible? How could a teacher's expectations change a student's actual intelligence and academic ability? The answer lies in the countless subtle ways that expectations influence behavior. Teachers who expected certain students to excel treated them differently in hundreds of small ways. They called on these students more often, waited longer for their answers, and gave them more detailed feedback. They made more eye contact, stood closer to them, and nodded more encouragingly when they spoke. When the special students made mistakes, teachers were more likely to work with them to find the right answer rather than moving on to someone else. When they gave correct answers, teachers praised them more enthusiastically. The teachers weren't consciously trying to give these students advantages. They were simply responding naturally to their expectations. But the effect wasn't just about teacher behavior. The students themselves began to internalize the expectations. When teachers consistently communicated confidence in their abilities, the students started to believe they were capable of more. This increased their motivation, effort, and willingness to take on challenging tasks. The Pygmalion Effect revealed that expectations are not passive predictions about the future. They're active forces that help create the future they anticipate. When we expect someone to succeed, we unconsciously behave in ways that make success more likely. When we expect someone to fail, we inadvertently create conditions that promote failure. The implications for education were staggering. If teacher expectations could produce measurable changes in student IQ, what did that say about the role of bias in academic achievement? How many students were being held back not by their own limitations, but by the low expectations of their teachers? Further research revealed that the Pygmalion Effect is remarkably pervasive. It shows up in military training, where drill sergeants' expectations influence recruit performance. It appears in the workplace, where manager expectations affect employee productivity. It's even found in medical settings, where doctor expectations can influence patient recovery. The effect is particularly powerful for students who are typically underestimated: minorities, students from low-income families, and those with learning differences. When teachers hold high expectations for these students, they often achieve at levels that surprise everyone, including themselves. But the Pygmalion effect can also work in reverse. When teachers hold low expectations, students often live down to them. This creates a vicious cycle where initial biases become self-fulfilling prophecies, trapping students in patterns of underachievement. Studies have found that teacher expectations are often influenced by factors that have nothing to do with ability: student names, appearance, family background, and previous siblings' performance. A teacher who taught a troublemaker named Michael might unconsciously expect less from the next Michael in their class. The most disturbing aspect of the Pygmalion effect is how early and how permanently it can set in. Students who are labeled as low achievers in elementary school often carry that identity throughout their academic careers. They internalize the low expectations and begin to see themselves as incapable of academic success. But understanding the Pygmalion effect also offers hope. If expectations can limit student achievement, they can also unleash it. Teachers who consciously work to hold high expectations for all students, not just the obvious high achievers, can help more children reach their potential. The key is recognizing that expectations are not neutral observations about student ability. They're powerful interventions that shape student reality. When a teacher truly believes a student can succeed, they communicate that belief through countless subtle behaviors that encourage success. This doesn't mean having unrealistic expectations or ignoring genuine learning differences. It means starting with the assumption that all students are capable of growth, and then creating conditions that support that growth. The Oak School experiment showed that the difference between a struggling student and a successful one might not be ability, motivation, or even hard work. Sometimes, it's simply having someone who believes in their potential and communicates that belief through their actions. Rosenthal and Jacobson had demonstrated something profound about human potential. We don't just predict the future, we participate in creating it. Our expectations about others don't just reflect reality, they help shape it. In classrooms, workplaces, and relationships, the beliefs we hold about people become forces that influence their actual performance. The Pygmalion effect reminds us that expectations are not just thoughts, they're tools. And like any tool, they can be used to build people up or tear them down. The false consensus effect. Imagine you're walking across your college campus when a researcher approaches you with an unusual request. They want you to walk around for 30 minutes wearing a large sign that says "Eat at Joe's Restaurant." Will you do it? Think about your answer for a moment. Now, here's the key question. What percentage of other students do you think would agree to do the same thing? In 1977, Lee Ross conducted exactly this study at Stanford University. What he discovered reveals one of the most pervasive biases in human thinking, one that affects everything from our political beliefs to our personal relationships. Students who agreed to wear the sign estimated that 62% of their fellow students would also agree. Students who refused estimated that only 33% would agree. In other words, people consistently assumed that others would make the same choice they did. This is the false consensus effect. We systematically overestimate how much other people share our opinions, values, and behaviors. If we like a particular movie, we think most people will like it too. If we find a joke funny, we assume others will laugh. If we think a political candidate is obviously the best choice, we can't understand how anyone could vote differently. Ross and his colleagues tested this in dozens of ways. They asked students whether they'd prefer a hamburger or a sandwich for lunch, whether they'd donate to charity, whether they supported capital punishment. Consistently, people overestimated how many others shared their preferences and opinions. The effect is so strong that it even applies to embarrassing or unusual behaviors. In one study, researchers asked people whether they'd ever picked their nose and eaten it. Yes, really. Those who admitted to this behavior estimated that 53% of people had done the same. Those who denied it estimated only 15% had. Even for something most people would be embarrassed to admit, the false consensus effect held strong. But why does this happen? Part of the answer lies in who we spend time with. We tend to surround ourselves with people who are similar to us. friends with similar values, colleagues with similar backgrounds, neighbors in similar economic circumstances. This creates an echo chamber where our views are constantly reinforced, making them seem more universal than they actually are. Social media has made this phenomenon worse. Algorithms show us content from people who think like us, and news sources that confirm our existing beliefs. We end up in bubbles where our opinions seem not just normal, but obviously correct. Anyone who disagrees must be either misinformed or morally deficient. The false consensus effect also serves a psychological function. Believing that others share our views makes us feel normal and validated. It's comforting to think we're part of the majority, that our beliefs and behaviors are the standard by which others should be measured. But this bias has serious consequences. In politics, it leads to genuine shock when elections don't go the way we expect. How could my candidate lose? Everyone I know voted for them. In business, it causes entrepreneurs to overestimate demand for their products, and marketers to assume everyone will respond to ads the way they do. Perhaps most damaging, the false consensus effect makes us less tolerant of people who disagree with us. If we assume that all reasonable people share our views, then anyone who disagrees must be unreasonable. We lose the ability to see legitimate disagreement as anything other than ignorance or malice. One of the most striking examples came from a study of Berkeley students in the 1,960 seconds. Researchers asked students to estimate what percentage of their peers supported various political positions. Liberal students consistently overestimated support for liberal positions, while conservative students overestimated support for conservative positions. Both groups were living on the same campus, attending the same classes, but they had completely different perceptions of the political climate. The false consensus effect isn't limited to opinions. It extends to abilities and behaviors too. Good students think most people are good students. Hard workers think most people are hard workers. Honest people think most people are honest. This can lead to frustration and misunderstanding when reality doesn't match our expectations. Understanding the false consensus effect can help us become more accurate in our judgments and more tolerant in our relationships. When you find yourself thinking everyone believes this or no reasonable person would do that, pause and ask yourself, do I have real evidence for this claim? Or am I just projecting my own views onto others? The next time you're surprised by an election result, a friend's opinion, or a colleague's behavior, remember the false consensus effect. We're all living in our own little worlds, assuming everyone else sees things the way we do. The reality is far more complex, diverse, and interesting than any of us imagine. The halo effect. It's 1946, and Solomon Asch is about to demonstrate how a single word can completely change how you see another person. He gives two groups of people identical lists, describing someone named Alan. Group A reads, Alan is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. Group B reads, Alan is envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, industrious, and intelligent. Notice something? It's the exact same list, just in reverse order. The only difference is whether the positive traits intelligent, industrious come first, or the negative traits envious, stubborn, come first. When asked to write impressions of Alan, the two groups painted completely different pictures. Group A, who heard the positive traits first, described Alan as someone who was brilliant but had some minor flaws. Maybe he was a bit too direct or impatient, but these were the excusable quirks of a talented person. Group B described the same traits as belonging to someone fundamentally problematic, someone whose negative qualities overshadowed any potential strengths. Same exact information, completely different impressions, all because of the order in which the traits were presented. Asch had discovered what psychologists now call the primacy effect, the tendency for first impressions to disproportionately influence how we interpret everything that comes after. But this was just the beginning of understanding a much larger phenomenon, the halo effect. The halo effect is our tendency to let one positive trait cast a golden glow over everything else about a person, or conversely, let one negative trait darken our entire perception. It's why attractive people are often assumed to be smarter, kinder, and more competent than they actually are. It's why we assume that someone who's good at one thing must be good at everything. Think about how this plays out in real life. A student who's well-dressed and articulate gets better grades for identical work. A job candidate who went to a prestigious university is assumed to be more capable. A CEO who's tall and confident is credited with company successes that might have nothing to do with their leadership. The effect is so powerful that it even influences experts who should know better. Studies have shown that teachers give higher grades to essays when they think they're written by good students, even when the essays are identical. Judges give harsher sentences to defendants they find unattractive. Doctors make different diagnoses based on their patients' appearance and demeanor. One of the most striking demonstrations involved wine tasting. Researchers took an ordinary bottle of wine and served it to experts at different price points, sometimes saying it cost $10, sometimes $150. The exact same wine received dramatically different ratings depending on the supposed price. The expensive wine was described as complex and sophisticated, while the cheap wine was dismissed as simple and harsh. The halo effect doesn't just influence how we see others, it shapes how we see everything. Companies with strong stock performance are assumed to have superior management, innovative strategies, and better corporate culture, even when their success might be due to luck or external factors. When the stock price falls, the same management team is suddenly seen as incompetent, their strategies as flawed, their culture as toxic. Perhaps nowhere is the halo effect more dangerous than in our political judgments. Once we decide we like a politician, we interpret their every action in the most favorable light possible. Their flip-flops become evolving positions. Their gaffes become speaking from the heart. Their failures become learning experiences. Politicians we dislike face the opposite problem. Their successes are downplayed, their motives questioned, their every word scrutinized for hidden meaning. The halo effect reveals something unsettling about human cognition. We don't really evaluate people or things independently on multiple dimensions. Instead, we form a quick overall impression and then adjust everything else to fit that impression. We think we're being objective, but we're actually working backward from a conclusion we've already reached. But here's what makes the halo effect particularly insidious. It's not just that we're biased, it's that our bias feels like insight. When we see an attractive person and assume they're intelligent, it doesn't feel like we're making an unfounded assumption. It feels like we're picking up on some genuine quality they possess. When we taste the expensive wine and find it superior, we're not aware we're being influenced by the price. We genuinely experience it as better. Understanding the halo effect can help us make better decisions, but it requires constant vigilance. When you find yourself thinking someone is good at everything, ask yourself what specific evidence you have for each trait. When you catch yourself assuming that someone with one negative quality is bad in other ways, pause and consider whether you're really evaluating them fairly. The halo effect reminds us that human judgment is far more subjective and malleable than we'd like to believe. We see what we expect to see, and we expect to see consistency, even where none exists. The question is, once you know your brain is doing this, can you catch it in the act? Deindividuation Studies. Halloween night, 1976. Children in costumes roam the neighborhoods of Seattle, going door to door for trick-or-treat. But some of these houses are part of a psychology experiment that will reveal something disturbing about human nature when we think we're anonymous. At certain houses, a researcher greets the costumed children and points to a bowl of candy. "Take one piece each," she says, then disappears into the house, leaving the children alone with the bowl. Hidden observers watch to see what happens. When children come to the door alone and are asked to give their names, only 8% take more than they're supposed to. But when children arrive in groups and remain anonymous behind their costumes, 80% break the rules and take extra candy. Philip Zimbardo, conducting this study, had discovered a phenomenon he called de-individuation, the loss of individual identity and responsibility that occurs when people are part of a crowd or feel anonymous. When we believe we can't be identified or held accountable, we become capable of behaviors we would never consider when acting as identifiable individuals. But the candy theft was just the beginning. Zimbardo wanted to understand how de-individuation might explain some of the darkest chapters in human history: lynch mobs, riots, genocides, and other forms of collective violence. In his most famous de-individuation experiment, Zimbardo brought college women into his lab and told them they would be administering electric shocks to another participant as part of a learning study. Half the women wore normal clothes and name tags that clearly identified them. The other half wore oversized white lab coats with hoods that covered their faces, and they were never identified by name. The results were chilling. The anonymous hooded women administered shocks that were twice as long as those given by the identified women. De-individuation had transformed ordinary college students into more aggressive, less empathetic people. Zimbardo found that several factors contribute to de-individuation. Physical anonymity is one. When people can't be identified, they feel less accountable for their actions. This is why online harassment is so common, why people behave differently at masked parties, and why protesters sometimes become violent when their faces are covered. Group immersion is another factor. When people lose themselves in a crowd, their individual identity becomes less salient. They start thinking less about their personal values and more about the group's norms. If the group is engaged in antisocial behavior, individuals are more likely to join in. Altered states of consciousness can also contribute to de-individuation. Alcohol, drugs, exhaustion, or intense emotional states can all reduce self-awareness and increase the likelihood of behavior that people would normally find unacceptable. The phenomenon helps explain many disturbing historical events. During the Holocaust, Nazi soldiers often wore uniforms that obscured their individual identities while emphasizing their group membership. Lynch mobs typically formed at night, with participants often covering their faces. Genocides frequently involve perpetrators adopting group identities that override their individual moral codes. But de-individuation isn't always negative. It can also explain positive collective behaviors like dancing at concerts, singing in choirs, or participating in religious ceremonies. When people lose their self-consciousness and individual inhibitions, they can experience powerful feelings of unity and transcendence. The key insight is that de-individuation reduces self-regulation, the internal monitoring system that usually keeps our behavior in line with our values. When self-regulation is weakened, people become more susceptible to external influences, whether those influences are positive or negative. Modern technology has created new forms of de-individuation. Online anonymity can lead to cyberbullying, trolling, and other behaviors that people would never engage in face-to-face. Social media can create digital mobs that attack individuals with a ferocity that would be unthinkable in person. But understanding de-individuation can also help us guard against its negative effects. Organizations can reduce antisocial behavior by increasing accountability and individual identification. Police departments have found that body cameras reduce excessive force complaints. Companies have discovered that removing anonymity from online platforms decreases harassment. On a personal level, awareness of de-individuation can help us recognize when we're at risk of behaving in ways that conflict with our values. When we're in crowds, wearing disguises, or feeling anonymous online, we need to be extra vigilant about maintaining our moral compass. The Halloween candy study might seem trivial, but it revealed something profound about human nature. We like to think our moral behavior is driven by internal principles that remain constant regardless of the situation. But de-individuation shows that our behavior is heavily influenced by external factors like visibility, accountability, and social context. When children thought they could steal candy without consequences, most of them did. When college students thought they could deliver anonymous electric shocks, they became more aggressive. When people think they can act without being held accountable, many abandon the moral standards they would normally uphold. De-individuation reminds us that being a good person isn't just about having good values. It's about creating conditions that make it easy to act on those values and hard to abandon them. Sometimes the difference between moral and immoral behavior comes down to whether we think anyone is watching.